So the ACT exam is about a week away, which means for a lot of us, panic mode starts to kick in. But you'll be happy to hear that there are actually a lot of things that you can do with just 5, 6, 7 days left to improve your score a decent bit right before the exam, even if you haven't studied that much before. So in this video, I'm going to go over a few tips across the sections of the exam, what you can do to make sure that you get as much out of this last period of time that you have before your test, so that this test that you have isn't just a waste and that you're not going into it without being prepared to some extent. And these tips and tricks will apply for you regardless of whether you've studied a lot for the exam or if you're just getting started. Obviously, the more practice you have, the more experience you have, it'll help you that much more. But that's not to say that it's impossible to improve or it's unlikely even to improve in a week. You can do a lot with just a week. I've seen students that I've tutored that have improved 6 points in just 2 weeks. So even getting a couple points in this last week is going to help you, and it's going to be worthwhile. Before we get started, just a couple things. We have free practice exams and free tutoring resources linked down below. So if you're someone that maybe you find this video and some of our other videos helpful, but you want a little bit more personalized advice or you want some more practice content, you can schedule a session with myself or one of our other ACT tutoring experts and get some personalized advice. It'll be a short 15-minute session, but it's one-on-one time. It's totally free, and you can ask really anything that you want, and we'll help you out, build a study plan for you, etc. So let's go ahead and get started. I have 5 things I want to go through in this video. And all 5 of these things are going to build off of what I discussed in my last video last week, which is how to study and cram for the ACT exam in 2 weeks. So we're going to kind of continue that study plan and process that we initiated 2 weeks ago. So I would recommend that you watch that video before this one to get the most out of all of this. Tip number 1, don't stress about it. Again, 1 week, especially if you haven't started studying too much or too seriously yet, it might seem like it's a little too late and that you should have started maybe months ago and you could have had a much higher chance of improving your score had you started a month ago. But what you can do to make sure you don't get too nervous is, first of all, accept the reality that you're not in an ideal situation. And second, accept the reality that even though the situation is not ideal, you can still make some progress. Don't get too fixated on hitting your target score. I mean, you might be scoring like a 19 or a 20 right now. Your target might be a 26, a 30, a 33. Forget the target score, just focus on getting a few points of improvement. If you can do that, if you can set a realistic goal for yourself, it'll make it a lot less stressful and prevent you from getting really anxious about the exam overall. Is it possible to improve a lot in just a week? Absolutely, especially if you're someone that maybe hasn't studied yet and you just take a practice exam and you've naturally just scored way higher than most students typically do on their first try. Like, yeah, that might happen to you. I've worked with someone like last week that happened to, but chances are not going to happen. And if you accept that reality, it makes the whole process a lot less intimidating, and you'll have just an easier time getting through this week and actually getting through the exam on test day. So first thing is, don't stress. You can definitely make progress. And like I said, people have done it. Even if you're starting at a low score, you can improve 6 points in 2 weeks and even a couple points just within a week. People have done it before. You can too, even if you're not the fastest learner or the smartest person in the world. Second tip is to take 2 to 3 tests this week, 2 to 3 full official timed practice exams. I recommend you use the official ACT prep guide. It has like 6 or 7 official tests in it. Go through those. You can split that up, take maybe 2 to 3 sections a day over this next week, and that'll get you don't even have to take 2 to 3 a day. You can probably take 1 to 2 a day, and you'll get through that many exams. But the reason you need to take that many is to get practice, get repetitions, practice the strategies, get used to the skills, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes. And that'll help you overall improve before test day. Speaking of mistakes, that brings me to tip number 3, and it is to review your mistakes on the practice exams that you take going forward, but also all of the exams that you took last week. If you follow the video that we discussed, where we discussed how to study in 2 weeks, we recommended that you start practicing last week for your 2-week cramming kind of period. So review those exams as well. Re-review those mistakes, even if you already reviewed them. After every exam, you should review all of your past mistakes, not just the one from the last exam, but from the last X exams, no matter what number X is. If it's 2, if it's 5, even if it's 10, I still recommend you review them, even just for a few seconds, just so you understand and you can go through in your head why you got that question wrong, what the skill is that's being tested in that question, what the correct answer is, obviously, and then lastly, what can you take away from the problem and implement next time you run into that question type, because question types will repeat, problem types will repeat. Sometimes almost the same exact problem will repeat, just with a different scenario and different numbers, but the same exact approach. So make sure that you review them and you keep re-reviewing them so that those mistakes get stuck in your head and you have ways to overcome those barriers when you're actually taking the test on that Saturday. I realize I just gave you tips number 3 and 4 in the same tip, but Tip number 3 was to, review the mistakes. Tip number 4 was to do it by looking at, thinking of those 4 questions that I just kind of walked you through, like, what's the mistake? Why'd you get it wrong? What can you take away from the problem? And the tip is to not just think about those things, but actually document them and journal them, write them down, because that'll help you remember that information, and it'll help you on test day just keep that in your mind. Because when you run into those problem types, again, those really repetitive ones that you've gotten wrong in the past and that you will run into again, you'll remember, okay, this is the methodology that I used that was correct or incorrect, and this is what I need to do to make sure I get it right. Keep in mind that the mistakes that you make are kind of what's sitting between you and your target score. So the more mistakes that you kind of learn, this is where you are, this is where you're at, and these are all the mistakes. The more of those mistakes that you learn and that you understand, the more you kind of bridge the gap between those two scores. So just keep that in mind when you're reviewing those mistakes. It'll keep you motivated. And the last tip that I have, this is going back to the last video that we had about the 2-week study plan. It is that the time for experimentation when it comes to choosing and finding which strategies for reading timing, for science skimming, for reading skimming, we recommended that you experiment and try to find methods that work for you. Hopefully over the last week you've done that. Now you should be at a place where you've found a method that you kind of like, and you can just keep practicing that method over and over again, whether it's a timing method, whether it's a skimming method, over and over again, to the point where by the time it's test day, you've kind of mastered it to an extent, right? If you keep experimenting with methods and keep changing things up in this last week, it's kind of too close to the test day to be changing your strategies drastically. You want to pick with, you want to stick with something and just practice and get better at that particular method. So if you haven't started experimenting yet, that's totally fine. Maybe you're just starting out. Try to just find strategies that you like. We'll recommend some videos in the description below about our recommended reading skimming methods, the timing methods, the same thing for science as well. So pick, maybe 1 or 2 of those, experiment with them on a practice exam or 2, and then depending on what you like, what works or what doesn't, you stick with that and you keep going forward. So that's about it. I know I just kind of rambled and packed a bunch of information into a 10-minute video, but the whole idea here is to make sure that you have as much information as you possibly can have and really need, no more, to just be as prepared as possible with a little amount of time. I always believe that cramming can be highly effective if you make the most of your time, if you focus on the right things and don't focus on the things that are really not necessary. If you stick to these fundamentals that I just gave you in this video and you stay consistent with doing the amount of practice that I recommended, that's really the key. Really, it should be its own tip. Tip number 7, be consistent. It's probably the most important. But if you do that, there is no reason why you shouldn't improve at least a little bit on your test. I'm not going to guarantee that you improve 3 points or even 2 points or 1 point. At the end of the day, that's on you. You have to be consistent. You have to do the work, but it's entirely possible. And like I said, I've seen students do it before. You can too, no matter how fast or slow of a learner you are. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, send a message on our website. That's probably the easiest way to reach us. All your messages on the site go straight to my phone and Rohit's phone, and we can answer your questions there. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll see you in the next video where we discuss how to cram in 4 days. So we're going to keep doing this, keep checking in, and these videos in this series can kind of be a way for you to progressively cram. Talk soon. Really what it just boils down to is you need to practice. Just practice.